This is a quick video talking about regions of the brain. First, I'll start with the Rhombencephalon and work my way up to the more complex parts of the brain, to the more newly developed or newly evolved areas of the brain. So first, there's the Rhombencephalon. This is the hindbrain, which, also known as the posterior brain, includes the medulla, the pons, the cerebellum, and surrounds the fourth ventricle. It is composed of inputs and outputs and tracts. The Mesencephalon is a subregion of the Rhombencephalon, which houses the pons, the raphe nuclei, and the cerebellum. The pons are large bulges in the brainstem, ventral to the cerebellum, and they relay information from the cerebral to the cerebellum. They are responsible for postural reflexes like sleep and breathing. Along with the medulla, they contain the raphe nuclei, or the serotonin cell bodies, which project to the whole brain. Also, the cerebellum is Latin for little brain, and they contain two hemispheres and are covered by cerebral cortex, and it also receives Purkinje cells, or deep cerebral nuclei. They are attached to the pons, and they house 50% of all brain cells. The cerebellum is very dense. Basically, the cerebellum control the sensory motor system. They integrate sensation from the cortex and modify motor control. They're used for fine motor movements. So, to sum it up, the cerebellum controls or is important for automaticity in movement, so like walking without consciously paying attention to the minute aspects in each step that one takes. And the cerebellum is in charge with automating any other movement that one eventually masters. So for example, walking or riding a bike, driving a car, learning to write, learning to cook, as into choppings, prepare things in a certain way, etc, etc, etc. Damages causes an inability to judge rhythm change, as well as speech, a loss of balance, a loss of steady posture, and the motor output is not as adapted to changing conditions, such as knowing what way or how to walk in, let's say, up a hill or on muddy terrain, for example, and also damages imprecise movement. The next subregion of the Rhombencephalon is the Myelin Cephalon, which includes the medulla and the cranial nerves. The medulla oblongata, or the oblong marrow, is an extension of the spinal cord into the skull, and it houses parts of the brainstem. It acts as the sensory and motor relay, controlling autonomic functions like breathing, blood pressure, digestion, swallowing, and heart rate. Damage here in the medulla oblongata is fatal. There are also the 12 cranial nerves. These relay sensory and motor information, the afferent and efferent, from the head, shoulder, neck, and visceral organs. Okay, the next region is the Mesencephalon. It is the part of the midbrain located in the brainstem between the hind and forebrain. It has two subregions. The first is the tectum, which is the roof, houses the Superior Colliculus, which receives input from the retina and visual cortex and is involved in visual reflexes. Individuals with blind sight can see even though they can't experience seeing it. That is an example of connection to the Superior Colliculus. The Inferior Colliculus, on the other hand, receives direct input from the ears and is involved in auditory reflexes. So if, let's say, there's a loud noise and someone flinches, that's to do with the Inferior Colliculus. Anyway, the tegmentum is the second subregion of the Mesencephalon. It is a ventral area of the midbrain comprised of fiber tracts and three main regions. It has the red nucleus, which controls fine hand movements. The periaqueductal gray is made of gray matter that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, and it is used for pain suppression. And there is also the substantia nigra, which are cells that contain dark pigments, and these are involved in movement. Dopamine is synthesized in the substantia nigra, and cells that deteriorate here are believed to cause Parkinson's disease. In addition, there is a part of the brain known as the prosencephalon, or forebrain, and the prosencephalon is divided into two distinct parts, one part known as the telencephalon, and the other known as the diencephalon. Diencephalon houses the basal ganglia, which includes the dorsal striatum, which houses the caudate nucleus and putamen, as well as the lenticular nucleus, which has the globulus pallidus and putamen, and the subthalamic nucleus, and substantia nigra is also kind of part of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is the decision maker, and the nucleus accumbens and limbic system influence the basal ganglia, but they are also responsible for procedural memory and habits. There are direct and indirect pathways, the direct pathways being responsible for exciting motor control, while the indirect pathways are responsible for inhibiting them. Also in the diencephalon is the thalamus, which means chamber in Latin. It is a major sensory and motor relay station where visual information goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, before going to the occipital lobe, or occipital cortex. All sensory information except smell goes to the thalamus, as well as feedback from the cortex and other structures involved in behavioral arousal. The thalamus is also responsible for sleep-wake cycles and has many fiber tracts. The spinothalamic nucleus, part of the thalamus, is in charge of relaying information about pain and temperature. The nucleus accumbens in the diencephalon encompasses the ventral striatum, which receives dopaminergic projections from the ventral tegmental area, or the mesolimbic pathway, and basically the nucleus accumbens is used in motivation, reward in things like social, food or drug stimulation, and aversion. Next we come to a large part of the diencephalon, known as the limbic system. Limbic meaning border. It is composed of the amygdala, the hippocampus, the cingulate gyrus or cortex, the olfactory bulb, and hypothalamus. It borders the brainstem and is involved in emotional regulation, motivation, and memory. The hypothalamus is ventral to the thalamus, and it is involved in survival mechanisms, homeostasis. It controls feeding, motivation, aggression, and sex. A lateral lesion to the hypothalamus causes anorexia, and a ventral medial lesion caused obesity. The hypothalamus communicates with the body via the autonomic nervous system and hormones released from the pituitary gland, the amygdala. It is located in the anterior and dorsal to the end loop of the hippocampus. The amygdala controls emotional regulation, and excessive stimulation causes fear, anxiety, and aggression. A lesion causes reduced emotional reaction, and thus no fear. The amygdala is used in learning, since it associates emotional reactions, emotional responses with events, thus helping to store memories. It regulates activity activity in the hypothalamus, the pituitary and adrenal glands, that being the HPA axis, in order to release cortisol. The hippocampus is another main part of the limbic system, hippocampus being Latin for seahorse. It has a loop structure and is critical for memory, such as working memory, spatial memory, and relational memory. Damage to the hippocampus implies that individuals cannot store new memories. With the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, this controls the release of cortisol in stressful events. The hippocampus is the most plastic area in the brain, since most new neurons are formed in the brain, as in neurogenesis occurs more in this region than any other region in the brain because of the formation of new memories. Next, and finally, we have the Telencephalon. The Telencephalon has cerebral cortices, which are two hemispheres that are connected via the corpus callosum. The Telencephalon houses the frontal lobe, which includes the prefrontal cortex and the motor cortex. The prefrontal cortex receives integrated sensory information from the association cortices, and all neurons are spiny neurons here. They control for planning, decision-making, working memory, personality, and executing behavior. They also help to regulate impulsivity. There's a place called Broca's area in the frontal lobe, which is in charge of speech production, and there is the primary motor cortex, which controls for motor functioning in the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe is in charge of processing auditory information via the thalamus and is connected to the amygdala and hippocampus. It also has the fusiform face area, which is specialized in facial recognition and expertise or recognition in objects, and there's Wernicke's area, which is in charge of speech and language comprehension. The parietal lobe receives and processes sensory information from the brain and is the primary somatosensory cortex that receives somatic sensations, touch, proprioception, or the position of body in space, temperature, and pain. Each part is mapped onto what we term the homunculus, or little man. Finally, there is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe processes vision via the thalamus, and it has the primary visual cortex, which is posterior of the cortex, and information goes to the secondary visual cortex. So in total, we covered the areas of the brain, including the Rhombencephalon, or hindbrain, which had the Mesencephalon and Myelin Cephalon. We also looked at the Mesencephalon, midbrain, the Diencephalon, which had the Limbic System, nucleus accumbens, Thalamus, and Basal Ganglia, and finally we looked at the Telencephalon with the frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal lobe. So yeah, this is the parts of the brain, and thanks for watching.